Anyway, good afternoon. So we're here to do a brief webinar relating to our this year's end of year report for the Whisky Cask market. And we're just going to discuss the findings in that report, and so hopefully you'll all get a little bit more insight into how the cask whisky market specifically has performed over the past year and how that compares with previous years. This is the fifth report. Let me just see if we can change this. So yeah, this is the fifth report we've done since 2019. As you can see on the screen there, we use a unique data model, a unique data modeling algorithm that's developed to analyze the whisky cask market, and this data comes from thousands of casks from over 80 distilleries that we here at Braeburn Whisky have worked with, and our partner companies. The BC20 Index specifically, we're going to have a chat about that, and that's derived from a subset of a representative sample of 20 casks from assorted distilleries and the categories. So as you can see here from this slide, the investment in the whisky industry is breaking records. We've a number of new distilleries that have opened and more that are set to open over the coming years. Whisky sales is recovering after what has been a difficult period, I think, for a lot of industries, certainly with the Scottish whisky production. We've been impacted obviously by COVID and various tariffs that have been introduced, which now thankfully have been dropped in one of our most important markets, that being the US. And now this recovery, we're starting to exceed pre-pandemic levels. So this is obviously very, very encouraging for all of us in the industry. So whisky providing a hedge against inflation. This is a headline we've seen a number of times over the past year or so. I think inflation currently is sat in the UK specifically at just over 10%. Looking at this graph here, this graph shows the average annual capital growth rate for 2022 based on sales of more than 6,000 casks across, as I said earlier, over 80 distilleries throughout Scotland. And this provides the largest data sample of whisky cask investment currently in the market. The 5 years of observation here provide a historical perspective on the stability of the whisky cask investment market. And despite fluctuations, stability remains an inherent quality of whisky casks, which steadily gain in value as the whisky matures by interacting the wood, and this is largely unaffected by the situation outside of the global economy. The wider whisky market continued the same steady ascent that has been observed throughout the past 4 years of the report's publication, and while the BC20 saw another breakthrough from the broader whisky market, while the overall whisky cask market observed average projected growth of 14.95%, which is 1.69% higher than 2021. The BC20 delivered 15.86%. The performance of the BC20 index demonstrates the impact that selecting the right combination of casks can have on overall return. So a diverse portfolio built on the back of advice from an experienced portfolio manager means that we can actually potentially enjoy higher returns than the average growth of 14.95%. The BC20 having delivered 15.86%. And again, that just demonstrates how good advice can actually maximize the returns that you see in the market. And despite market fluctuations, stability remains an inherent quality of whisky casks, which steadily gain value as the whisky matures in the cask. However, as the overall value of casks increased significantly in 2022 to a spike in inflation, so did the average price of cask. So we have a little bit of anomaly there. This has had particular impact on the rises seen on the selection we use for the BC20 Index. As well as the fact that many of these casks have now crossed into more premium classifications. So we do see higher prices as a result of that. So the BC20 Index rises. As I said, it's derived from a subset of all available cask data, which collates the projected values of a representative sample of 20 casks from assorted distilleries and categories. The chosen distilleries represent a wide geographic spread and varying levels of eminence, ranging from quite niche to very famous. Most importantly, strong trading volume across these selected distilleries provides us with sufficient data points to develop accurate projections, and we use these tools obviously to gain some insights into the overall health of the cask market. As the headline says there, growth in the BC20 Index underlines the importance of building a diverse portfolio based on the advice of an experienced portfolio manager. So the BC20 Index showed significant growth in 2022, outperforming the average gain exhibited by the general whiskey cask market, as I said, by 1.5%. This demonstrating that variations inherent in the whiskey cask market, with some distilleries and casks outperforming the average, depending on factors like changes in a distillery's reputation, increased investment, or marketing strategies. So quite often, I talk to clients about the evolution in the whiskey industry, how almost all of these old heritage distilleries were built specifically to provide casks of whiskey. Then when they start to sort of bottle their own single malt expressions, the distillery owners then start to invest in the brand, and we see sort of consumer awareness of that particular distillery increasing, and that does have obviously a positive impact on the value of these casks. So it can be quite a sort of savvy way of diversifying your portfolio, is to include distilleries which we describe today as invisible distilleries, working on the assumption that these distilleries are in the future are going to be joining other frontline distilleries that are previously what we called invisible. Whiskey casks continue to outperform the market. You can see there from the graph how whiskey has performed relative to sort of more traditional investment vehicles. So this graph shows a projected value of a portfolio over time, assuming an initial investment of £100,000, which was made in July of 2018. So over this period, the BC20 Index has continued to show the most consistent growth among all the asset classes, demonstrating stability, as we've said, in the whiskey cask market and its ability to withstand outside or external economic shocks. In 2022, we saw inflation spike. Whiskey casks have outperformed traditional investments as well as other tangible assets by a significant margin. And according to the figures that we have, a £100,000 investment in July 2018 would have been worth £214,000, to just over £214,000 for a cask of whiskey. In December 2022, just under £151,000 for gold, and an investment in the best performing stock index, the SP 500, would have been worth £132,000. Just over £132,000. So the data analysed in this report now includes periods of what we describe as significant economic uncertainty, the COVID pandemic obviously being the main element there. And we've seen these market corrections with cryptocurrencies, for example, spiking inflation, obviously, but it gives us some real insight into the potential of whiskey casks as a secure investment when we're faced with these sort of challenging investment horizons. Looking at the top 20 distilleries in terms of average annual capital growth, and you can see there that Islay distilleries are very well represented. 2022, we were able to collect data from over 80 distilleries, which represents more than 60% of Scotland's distilleries spread out across all whiskey making regions. This increase in data points gives us a wider perspective on the overall health of the market and points to some interesting factors that impact the price of whiskey casks across these different distilleries. All of the top 20 performing distilleries saw growth in 2022, clearly pointing to a rise in the whole market, driven to some extent by inflation, and importantly, a growing demand for quality single malt whiskey. There are a few surprises in this data, with most of the top performing distilleries in the last report featuring again. The table is now led by Lefroy, as we can see there, which saw a 3.16% rate of growth in 2022 compared to 2021. And the rest of the distilleries in the top 5 were also familiar from our previous reports. We have there Stoicia in second place, Bunnahabhain in third, and Highland Park, the first non-Islay distillery of the top performers coming forth. And the Islay distillery Callear took the 5th spot from last year's surprise entry, which was Mortlach, which has now dropped down to 6th position. Overall, there's been little change in the distillery rankings, which demonstrates good internal stability for the whiskey cask market. However, we've seen prices rise across the board, particularly for younger casks, and the expectation is we might see some more movement there in the coming months. But this clearly demonstrates stability. And whilst Islay distilleries sit at the top, investors shouldn't assume that similar returns can't be achieved from distilleries in other regions. And again, this points towards the importance of receiving good advice. Islay keeps rising. Analyzing regional data provides us with an interesting insight into consumer tastes and cask preference. However, investors are far more likely to focus on seeking out casks from specific distilleries rather than making their purchase based on the whiskey making regions, as increasing the value of a whiskey cask is not related to its regional provenance. Obviously, not all distilleries are equal, as we say. But in this edition of the report, it includes regional data so we can keep a track of the trends. And you see here from this particular table that Islay again is our top performer. Campbelltown, with currently only 3 distilleries producing whiskey there. These are typically incredibly hard casks to acquire. We have the Islands and Speyside. But I think the point there to really highlight is that Islay, relative to the other producing regions, putting Campbelltown to one side, has a relatively small amount of distilleries. They're typically hard casks to acquire. Speyside obviously has a vast amount of distilleries, and in amongst those excellent Speyside distilleries, we're always going to be able to identify cask investment opportunities that are comparable with the sort of returns we see with Islay. But there is, as it says here, there's no doubt, due to the concentration of highly regarded and famous distilleries on the whiskey island of Islay compared to Speyside, which, as we said, has also got some excellent distilleries, but home to many more lesser ones, which drives down the average. So again, good quality advice is important here. There are excellent opportunities to be taken advantage of in all the whiskey producing regions, but obviously, given the unique situation we have with Islay, that subsequently forces it to the top of the table. And the Lowlands, which is historically not a great performer, we're seeing a lot of activity now in that particular region. Some excellent distilleries that have come online, so we expect a bit of a resurgence over the coming years of lowland distilleries. And despite that, what looks like poor performance from that particular region, again, this is whiskey producing region that's very much on its uppers, as they say. So exceptionally strong performance from Islay casks last year, achieving growth that was almost 3% higher than that figure for 2021. But as I said, it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on the data that's emerging from the Lowlands over the next few years, as we've seen a lot of investment in that particular region. New makes rise as inflation hits. Now, this table shows the average projected annual capital growth figure for each age range of casks. Younger casks offer a greater percentage return for those with the patience to wait. This is a fact. And it's obviously a more affordable entry sort of cost. And while cask choices at an older age will require a greater initial investment, these are obviously casks that are already in their prime and give the investor the greater flexibility. But every year they are projected to yield a significant return in pure monetary terms. And we look at the blue chip cask and the premium cask, and this sort of the percentage there suggests that you'll enjoy lower returns. But again, when we're talking about these premium casks, we're talking about a much higher capital outlay, which obviously translates into higher capital return. But certainly the higher percentages we've seen have been associated with these younger whiskies that are or these younger spirits that are actually becoming whiskey over the course of those first 3 years of maturation. So while these significant increases are interesting, what we have to be mindful of when we look at new makes, and it sort of throws the data out a little bit, is the rising cost of new makes, and the rising cost of production and how that's impacted us. We're nearly 40% rise in the price of new fill casks in 2022. So interesting to observe, but it should be noted that this is not indicative of gains which an investor could reasonably expect in the months to come. Because as I said, what we're looking at here is a market that's been impacted by inflation. And as a result of that, we are ultimately paying more for those new fill casks. And this is why we're seeing this percentage. The demand for older casks is kept high by their rarity, obviously, a feature that intensifies with every passing year as their contemporaries or stock from those years is bottled. In addition, the higher price of new make casks does permeate across the broader market. You know, these older casks ultimately become more expensive to replace. So it's expected that these increases will have an impact also on aging stock. However, the significant rises in raw materials, energy production costs, which is impacting distilleries right across Scotland, is going to continue to push the price of new makes higher, certainly for the foreseeable future, which will inevitably impact the returns that investors can expect from this age group over the next few years. Really interesting data here. Investor demographic. It's interesting to see that we have seen some significant growth in the amount of millennials that have chosen to invest in whiskey casks. The stereotype of the typical whiskey drinkers is sort of endured for decades, but we seem to be enjoying a change. Younger and more diverse range of consumers discovering the pleasures of single malt. As interest in drinking whiskey is on the increase, that correlates directly with the interest in investing in whiskey casks, and it's no surprise that the profile of investors is also changing. Some of the data that we're looking at here includes an analysis of the age and gender of whiskey cask investors. In 2022, the majority of investors were what we call Generation X, 1965 to 1980, consisting of just over 43% of total cask buyers. However, they're closely followed by younger investors, millennials, 1981 to 1996, and now they represent 35 or just over 35% of investors that we see coming into the market to acquire casks. And I think also as well with the millennials investing in alternative assets, it's probably a reflection of younger investors' willingness to look at alternative assets as sort of trust in more traditional institutions or investment vehicles has been eroded over the past few years. So that's quite interesting. So despite market fluctuations, the stability remains an inherent quality of whiskey casks, which steadily gain value as the whiskey matures in the cask. Obviously, one of the key drivers of the value of whiskey assets is time, and that's what we're investing in. What to look out for in 2023? Well, we'll be looking at how will growth in the whiskey market impact cask investors. So the expectation is that's going to impact us in a positive manner. Will the cask market continue to provide stability? That's a second. Sorry, you might have lost me there for a second. Something happened there. But will the cask market continue to provide stability? There's nothing to suggest at all that won't be the case. That's certainly been our experience over the past several years. How will the arrival of new technology impact the market? And certainly in terms of whiskey production, it's having a massive impact. We've got a big obligation to reduce our carbon footprint and emissions. This is something that the whiskey industry is well ahead of. I think we're about 10 years ahead of the targets that have been set. And with an expected recovery in global markets, fingers crossed, how will the BC20 Index perform against other asset classes? Well, obviously, from every investor's perspective, the hope is that the global markets will recover. But from the previous numbers we've seen, whiskey cask investment is always perceived as, and certainly historic performance tells us that it will perform well, even when we're looking at a landscape where investment options are performing certainly better than they are today. Which casks and distilleries can we expect to perform well in 2023? Well, one thing that I spend a lot of time pointing out to potential investors, existing investors, is that we are and we have been seeing this evolution in the whiskey industry for decades now, and all these what were previously invisible distilleries, now frontline distilleries recognized by consumers around the world. This is part of the evolution, and there are still opportunities out there in the market for these silent distilleries that are going through this evolution, and for us to ride the coattails of these distilleries that are investing more in their brand, investing more in their own core bottlings. So it's quite an exciting period for us. Which ones could start to drop out of the top 10? Well, let's see. I couldn't answer that. But certainly I expect Islay this year, again, to be the top performing region. But as I said, don't let that in any way sort of discouraging you from looking at Speyside and the other regions in Scotland. But our sort of key message there is good advice is key to your portfolio working for you. That's pretty much everything covered there. We are doing a Q&A. Let's see, if you've got any questions, please do feel free to fire them at me, and I'll try my level best to answer them for you. We do have one question here. Oh, okay. Kurt's asking, is there any way of finding out what your current barrel is worth without having to try and sell it? Yeah, we're always happy to appraise a cask. If you have a cask that perhaps isn't something that you bought specifically from us, but you'd like an appraisal, we're always happy to do that. And of course, if you're a client, we will appraise your cask for you every anniversary of its distillation date. So Matt's asking us, how best can you find out if an invisible distillery plans to go public? This is a really good question. And even today, the sort of transparency in the production levels, that sort of thing. We don't, it's perhaps not as transparent as we would like it to do, but quite often if a distillery is perhaps going, we've just recently saw, what was it, Tullibardine was just recently sold. But if a distillery is changing hands, for example, that could be if a clear indication that there's further investment in the to come in the distillery. If you see initial sort of entry-level bottlings coming out from a distillery, the key thing is to look out for the distillery's core bottlings. And as we start to see those hit the market on the back of that, you're then going to see the distillery owners start investing in the brand and obviously increasing brand awareness and the consumer awareness. What is your strategy to have more access to restricted casks? I must confess, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question when you say restricted casks. There are certain distilleries that don't release their liquid into the secondary market. They may have done that historically, which means we do get access to older, more mature liquid. Macallan's a great example. My understanding is they haven't released anything into the secondary market since the late 90s. So these casks are extremely difficult to acquire. But when you say restricted casks, we do have a scenario quite often where distilleries will release liquid, but they'll put in place covenants that prevent the use of the distillery name when this liquid is eventually bottled. And that sort of restriction on naming rights is something that we would steer away from, because clearly we're investing in the brand as well as the liquid inside that casks. Laszlo is asking, what technologies are emerging lately in relation to whiskey? There's an awful lot, and I don't know if I'm sort of the best qualified to answer that question, but certainly the use of waste to run the distillery, run the stills, that sort of thing, whereas that waste might have gone into landfill. I know that we've reduced our sort of landfill footprint, if that's the right expression, quite significantly. So a lot of the waste is being reused by certain distilleries to power their operations. One of the other sort of areas that's being looked at is what's known as the angel share, and trying to reduce that evaporation, because there's a significant amount of vapors going into the atmosphere. And also the use of wood moving forward as well is an area that the industry is having to look at closely. We are faced with a bit of a crisis in terms of the supply of good quality barrels. Tom is asking, yeah, Tom, it's a good question. Is the balance of investing in lower returning regions, the Lowlands, for example, balanced out with the lower cost of these barrels? Do we typically see lower prices here? Yes, is the short answer, but we've got some new distilleries coming online and they're pricing their casks in line with today's market. These are producing excellent spirits that tend to be a sort of longer term investment, but ultimately looking for value, we'll find value in all of the regions. As I said earlier, there are distilleries in Speyside that are producing excellent malts, have been producing excellent malts for decades, but there's still value there in terms of acquiring the cask, because you will pay a premium, as I said, for casks from distilleries that have that high sort of profile, maybe frontline profile. So there's value to be taken advantage of in both the Lowlands and all of the other whiskey producing regions. But and that's certainly something that we're looking out for. Leo's asking, how important is the cask wood finish to value? Is re-racking still a good value add strategy with the increase in price of cooperage and oak cask? Well, the simple answer is yes, but this is pretty important. There's this sort of idea that just by taking your spirit and re-racking it, that's ultimately or invariably going to result in a higher value whiskey. There is an awful lot, it's so complicated, and this is why we employ professionals to take care of your casks for you. There are periods over the course of the whiskey's maturation where re-racking or decanting that spirit into a new cask is going to help the whiskey mature into something wonderful. But we have to be careful about that. You know, we don't want to re-rack everything. If we've got a whiskey that's going to be maturing for an awful long time, one thing we want to avoid is killing that whiskey with too much wood or too much sherry or whatever the cask might be that we're looking at. So yes, Leo is the answer. It is a good value add strategy, but we have to, we want to look at each individual cask on an individual basis and determine what is the best strategy or approach with that particular whiskey. Tom, you bought Tobermory in 2021. Is the fact that they've been purchased a good thing or not? Absolutely. It's a really exciting time for Tobermory. They've just invested really heavily in production, which was right across the three sister distilleries, Bunnahabhain, Deanston and Tobermory have recently all had refits. Tobermory is going to increase its output, I'm quite sure, on the back of that. And obviously, as is the case with any business, when you're doing this, you're going to invest in the brand. And we're already seeing Tobermory, gaining additional brand recognition amongst consumers. I'm being asked, to what extent do we think the price of new make casks might increase? I.e., do you think they'll become significantly more expensive? Well, I think we've gone through the worst of it. Inflation obviously still quite high. I think a lot of the increasing costs we've seen as a result of sort of barley becoming more expensive for obvious reasons. We talked about wood, glass, energy obviously being key, but I think a lot of that now is translated through to today's market price for a new fill cask. So whilst yes, we do expect some increase, inflation is always going to play its part. I think we've seen, certainly for the next year, the most significant price increase as last year's production costs fed through. If you were a betting man, what distillery would you invest in 2023? That's from Guy. Hi, Guy. There are a number of them out there, and there are different reasons to invest in different distilleries. I'm a great fan. If you're going to say, I was a betting man, what distillery would I invest in 2023? Glenelg is a wonderful distillery that we're seeing now is really establishing itself as one of Speyside's most important malts. And but there are plenty of distilleries. When you consider, Guy, we've got 140 distilleries out there. There's more than one distillery that I would say make sense as an investment vehicle. That answers your question. The quick answer is there's a lot of options out there. It would be difficult for me to tie down one in particular. So this is a good question. Is the secondary market mostly dependent on transactions using brokers, intermediaries, or is there a healthy, visible auction mechanism? I think one of the concerns the investors is around the question of transparency. And I completely recognize that. Transparency is something that's not typically been associated with the whiskey industry. If you consider the history of these distilleries, the illicit stills, et cetera, and the fact that the whiskey cask investment market is only recently been opened up to retail investors. And obviously, what is key to investors is that element of transparency. So yes, there is an auction mechanism, but typically you'll find that the sale of Whisky Cask is done through brokers. And ultimately what you have to remember with this cask of whiskey is that one day the ABV is going to arrive at a point where we have to bottle that. And that cask then has to go to an independent bottler. And typically independent bottlers are going to be buying their liquid, their spirit from brokers. So we do still play a pretty important role when it comes to you putting a cask of whiskey back into the market and obviously realizing the return. Graham, I think I know who this is. Hi, Graham. Graham has casks with different companies. Would Braeburn take them under the wing? Yes, absolutely. That's something that we can facilitate, Graham. If you sort of get in touch and sort of give me a bit more detail, we can get that taken care of for you. Capacity is a real issue in Scotland at the moment. So and lead times are sort of pretty dramatic. So it does take a bit of time, but the simple answer is yes, absolutely. Patrick's asking, why do some of the big hitters make their whiskies available for public purchase? Why not keep the potential profits for themselves? Again, good question. And I'll always sort of bring you back then to the history of whiskey production. You've got to remember that most of the big hitters, when we talk about the likes of Lefroy and we talk about Macallan, Glenlivet, you know, they actually don't release their whiskey into the secondary market. But there are still distilleries that are working to the original model, which is to provide whiskey for the use in the secondary market by the blenders or bottlers that want to bottle as single malts. Traditionally, these casks were being provided to blenders that would blend the whiskey and subsequently bottle it under their own brand. And that's obviously a very important element of these distilleries' business. And still to this day, 90% of the whiskey that that's bottled is going into blends. And if you look, whilst a lot of these these brands are owned by distillery owners, there are some significant companies out there that are not distillers themselves and rely on the supply of whiskey in the secondary market to sort of obviously keep their brands alive. So nothing's going to really change there, but there is also this element of when a distillery really sort of becomes recognized as a frontline distillery, there's a high demand for their spirit. Obviously, you know, there's only so much whiskey they can produce year on year, and then maybe these distilleries will reduce the amount of liquid that they're releasing into the secondary market. And Kurt, to sort of address your question there, so and when that happens. And this is what we see, and we've seen for years, decades now, that when a distillery does actually reduce or stops putting whiskey into the secondary market, then clearly that's going to have a really positive impact on the value of those casks that are out there still maturing in bond. Is the information for the new cask availability at Braeburn shared equally with all clients? Yes, but it is important, obviously, that if you're a client of us here at Braeburn Whisky, that you've got a regular line of communication with your portfolio manager. It is becoming increasingly harder for us to secure these casks. That's one of the challenges, but that is also a positive from an investor's perspective. Obviously, scarcity is one of the key drivers of value in your asset. But we'll always, what tends to happen with the new fill casks, because they're a relatively low entry point, they're sort of an option for a lot more investors. I know it sounds a little glib, but they're a bit of a no-brainer from an investment perspective, as long as you're prepared to show that patience. So we do invariably have a really quick uptake on them. And sometimes if you're not in regular contact with your broker or your portfolio manager, then it may well be that you miss some of these releases. And we're constantly trying to sort of demonstrate this to our clients that you know, there is a high demand for these things, not only time driving the value, but scarcity driving the value as well. And there is we quite often have casks that hit the market and are sold within a matter of hours, and it does leave some investors a little bit disappointed. It does leave investors frustrated. I always say, look, sort of prepare yourself for a little bit of disappointment. We certainly here at Braeburn Whisky aren't in the business of pushing people into making investment decisions. The idea is we can provide you with enough information for you to make an informed decision. But sometimes, you know, to acquire those sort of rarer whiskies, then it does, you know, sometimes you have to sort of move quite quickly, or otherwise the opportunity is taken by somebody else. How often should you ask for a cask regauge, or do Braeburn suggest it? Is it useful information? This is from Gareth. When we talk about sort of regauging, testing the liquid in that cask, it's obviously one of the most important things is to establish the volume of liquid that's in that cask and the strength of that liquid that's in the cask, so we can identify if there's any problem with the cask. If year on year it's lost an awful lot of liquid, then clearly there's a problem. Just to qualify, that's not a problem we necessarily encounter. All of the whiskey stored in a very consistent atmosphere, so evaporation levels right across Scotland are pretty consistent. And then if you talk about leakage, again, you know, if a cask leaks, you're not going to see sort of whiskey pouring all over the floor of the dunnage warehouse. What tends to happen is you'll see staining on the outside of that cask, and the team will then plug that leak up. And typically with a leaking cask, you're not going to see a massive amount of volume lost before the issue is taken care of. When would you regauge a cask? If you've got a particularly old cask that hasn't been regauged for a number of years, Braeburn would advise you to get that cask regauged. Again, we're partners in this, and the last thing that any of us want is a cask of whiskey that the ABV is dropped dangerously low. So we have to stay on top of these older whiskies and just ensure that we're not being caught out, we're not being taken by surprise. So typically, Gareth, we would suggest it. The younger casks, it's not really an issue. We can calculate fairly accurately what ABV that cask will be and what volume of liquid will be there based on sort of industry standards across Scotland. But certainly with the older and more valuable casks, you do want to be keeping a closer eye on the contents of the cask. So Richard's, I've seen some negative press recently regarding ownership of casks. How can we be assured that we actually own what we think we own? It's a very, very good question. And obviously this relates again to transparency and autonomy over your asset. There is a suggestion, and there's quite a bit of misinformation out there, Richard, to be quite frank. And I'd always say, if you have any doubts, then you should be going to the Scottish Whisky Association. They're a great source of information for you. And if you've got any sort of anxieties about ownership, I think the Scottish Whisky Association will give you assurances there. And obviously HMRC. Now, we hear a lot of noise about this document called a DO, a delivery order. There's certain people out there that suggest that if you don't have a DO, you don't own your whiskey, which is completely inaccurate. A DO or a delivery order doesn't determine who owns the whiskey. But a delivery order is to facilitate the moving of a cask of whiskey from one warehouse to another, or from one account at the same warehouse to another account there, and that enables HMRC obviously to track that spirit, that alcohol, and in the event that it's not there, then somebody's obviously responsible for the payment of duty on that alcohol. So the delivery order is not a demonstration of ownership. That is demonstrated, as the Scottish Whisky Association has said several times, your purchase agreement, proof that you bought that cask, the certificate, which clearly states the details of that cask, where it's located and what that cask number is. You own that cask. It's simply under our management, and obviously you do need somebody to manage the whiskey for you, as I've said earlier. I think one of the key sort of problem or sort of anxieties that investors have is this autonomy over your cask of whiskey. If your broker disappears or is no longer in business one day, how do I get access to my cask of whiskey? Well, you can clearly demonstrate that you own that cask of whiskey. And the Scottish Whisky Association do advise that you are that the warehouse is aware that you are the owner, just to give you that increased autonomy. So yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of fear mongering going on out there. Some people are causing anxiety, or perhaps giving people anxieties that are unwarranted. I don't think it's a particularly good way to sort of conduct your business. But I would always say, go to the Scottish Whisky Association, go to HMRC for clarification on it. And the Scottish Whisky Association clearly states that ownership of your cask can be demonstrated by purchase agreement and certificates. From your own personal perspective, you just want to be assured that the distillery that's storing your cask of whiskey understands that this is yourself that owns it. How are you able to accurately price the casks of new distilleries when some have neither released their own bottlings or released their casks to private investors? There's always going to be some correlation, Michael, between the bottle prices and the value of their cask of whiskey. Obviously, that has to be the case. And that applies to every distillery, whether it be an old one or a new one. When we're talking about new fills, you know, the distillery has its margin to add. We talked about the associated cost of production, and that's why you will find across the market when it comes to new makes that there's consistency there with the pricing. Are we expecting a future ban on the use of peat and hence heavily peated malt whiskies? No, is the answer. There's this idea that perhaps the Scottish whisky industry is depleting peat supplies. That's not the case. In actual fact, the availability of peat in Scotland is increasing, and the whisky industry is very conscientious about their use of peat. So no. Absolutely not, and that would have a devastating impact on regions like Islay that obviously are sort of world famous for having this peated character to their whiskey. Jake, will we be sharing the report? Yeah, you can actually download it directly from our site. I would recommend going to our site and having a look. You can download it there. If you want to pop your email in here, Jad, I can certainly email a copy out to you. But yeah, it's available for download via our website. Okay, well, that looks like I've sort of answered everything in there. I sincerely hope that has been of some use to you all and has given you some sort of valuable insights into what's currently going on in the whiskey cask market. And obviously, if you are a client or if you're not a client, please, do get in touch. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, sort of the idea being that we can give you enough information to make an informed decision as to whether or not whiskey cask ownership is the right investment for you. So thanks everybody for your time. Thanks for attending. I think I've got everything answered there, so I will let you all get back to the rest of your day. Thanks again. Cheers. Bye-bye.